Hello everyone, welcome. Welcome to our first webinar. My name's Curtis. I'm from a company called Leadtosale. Essentially what we do is track all the leads that come through from your website, track all your sales, and then reconcile those and send events to Google Analytics when they match. So it means lead gen businesses can track sales and leads instead of just leads. And today we'll be going through Google Tag Manager basic training. So I've got a little agenda here. Hopefully, I'll just share make sure my screen's shared. Yep, you guys can see that. So yeah, we've already gone through about us. I'm going to have a little chat to you about clowns, and then talk about what the actual point of GTM is, and then we're going to go through installation very briefly and a couple of useful tools for you. And then we're going to jump into it. So we're going to set up some tracking completely live. So bear with me if some things don't actually work, but I'm sure we'll eventually get there. And then we'll have a little Q&A at the end. So if you do have any questions, you can jump into the chat and ask them there. And if there's any ones that we see that we'd share with the group, that Mike will pin them, and then we can talk about them at the end, or Mike will just, Mike is my business partner, he'll answer them in the chat. So clowns, okay. So my background is that I did a stats degree at uni, and as part of that degree we had to do some pure maths papers, and one of my lecturers on the first lecture of the semester said to everyone, you don't get good at juggling by watching the clowns. And what she meant by this is that you'll often go into a lecture or a presentation similar to this that has an educational component to it, and you'll watch someone do something and then you'll be like, yes, I can do that. But later on, you'll get to a scenario when you actually have to do it and you will have no idea what you're doing. So the point is that you may watch me do this and feel like you know it, but you won't actually know it until you do it yourself and try it and struggle through it. So if there's one thing I want you to take away from this is that you don't get good at juggling by watching the clowns. So go practice this, do it. I'll share what we do with you in the handout section of GoToWebinar, so you can have a look at what we've done and review it later and have a play around with it yourself. The tools that we're going to be going through today will actually allow you to practice on anyone's website really, and without any consequences. So that's that. Make sure you practice. So what's the point of GTM? Back in the day, you'd be really at the whim of web developers when it came to implementing web analytics. So even something as simple as the Google Analytics page view snippet, you'd have to have a back and forth with a developer. It'd end up costing you $150 and you wouldn't actually get anything particularly useful out of it. So a whole lot of different companies came up with a solution to this, and one of those companies is Google. And Google Tag Manager allows you to implement tracking snippets like the Google Analytics snippet on websites without you having to go through the web developer, and all you need to do is just put one little bit of code on your website. So it stops that back and forth with the developer, particularly when their core competency isn't actually around web analytics. So it just saves you a whole lot of time and money and effort and pain, and the tool is actually completely free from a Google perspective. There are some paid options out there, but Google Tag Manager can pretty much do everything that those paid options do. So let's just jump into it. I'm going to take you through the installation. So let's just go ahead and create a new account. So I'm just going to call this test webinar. Say New Zealand. This doesn't matter, you can call it whatever you want, just call it something useful so you can find it later. Google Tag Manager can actually be used on a whole lot of different places like iOS apps, Android apps, and AMP pages, but for today we're just going to be focusing on the web use case. You're going to have to accept the terms and conditions. So here we are. So this is the Google Tag Manager snippet that you're going to have to get installed on your website. And what I'd say for those people that are just starting out is I would rely on web developers to put this on websites if you're not feeling confident. They should have absolutely no problems at all putting this on a website. You might have a little bit of back and forth, but it shouldn't actually be a problem. If you're feeling quite confident, there's actually some plugins that you can use for stuff like WordPress. If you just type into Google, Google Tag Manager for WordPress, you'll find a really useful plugin, which means that you won't have to worry about any code whatsoever. And then all you need to do is put in your GTM container ID, and you'll be able to get it live on the website. Platforms like Squarespace, Duda, etc. also have a really easy way for you to be able to implement these sorts of snippets. So generally, if you just type in installing Google Tag Manager, Squarespace, or Duda, you'll find the answer. But again, if you're not feeling confident, just rely on the developers to do this. So we're not actually going to do a live example of installing this because we have another tool that we can use to essentially have Google Tag Manager on there just within your browser window. So that means that you can test a full implementation of Google Tag Manager without actually having to have the code on there yet. And you can test some stuff that's actually quite finicky, like form submission tracking, without having to go back and forth with the developer if it doesn't work properly. And we'll get to form submission tracking later. So I'll just show you. This is a Chrome extension. So you just need to type into Google Tag Manager Injector, and it'll be the first option that comes up. I've already installed this on my Chrome, so it won't give me the option to download it, but you'll have a button to download it just here, and it'll appear up here. So I'll show you how that works. I just need to get my container ID from here, so I'm going to copy and paste that. And then head over to the website that I'm going to test my implementation on. So this is just a dummy website that I've got from a platform called Duda. So you can actually create a dummy website for free and have a play around with it and test all your tracking in practice. And I've actually already got another Google Tag Manager container on here. This is Tag Assistant. This is another useful, I'll actually just take you through that. So Google Tag Assistant essentially just shows you all the different Google tags that you have live on a website and whether they're implemented properly. This is a free version of this particular website platform, so the existing Tag Manager stuff won't work, but it will work when I use Injector, and I'll just show you that now. So I'm going to take my Google Tag Manager ID. And I'm just going to paste it in there, and then I'm going to look at the domain that I'm on and enter that in here. I suggest you use regex, and if you just don't have any sort of regex characters in there, it'll treat it like it contains this. And then we'll hit start. So now, hopefully, we'll see that the Google Tag Manager container that we just created, this one, is now on there just in our browser window. So we can go ahead and implement tags, test them, etc. And the developer won't even have to have put the code on there yet, which is really helpful and really useful. So I'm going to go ahead and create a Google Analytics account so we actually have somewhere to send the data. Cool, so now that we've got our Google Analytics tracking code, we can go ahead and start implementing some tags in Google Tag Manager to send some data to this. So in GTM, you've got tags, triggers, and variables. So tags are just little bits of code that send information off to third parties. So one of those third parties will be Google, but you can also have Facebook tags, Hotjar tags, Outbrain tags, LinkedIn tags, whatever. There's just anything that you want to track, you'll be implementing it in a tag. And triggers and variables. Triggers are essentially like the rules that determine when that data is sent off to third parties. And variables are what you use to build up your triggers and tags, and they're essentially just values that change depending on the scenario. So that will probably make a little bit more sense once we actually get into it. So the first thing we're going to do is implement our Google Analytics page view tag. So that's just exactly the same as getting this code onto your website, except we're just doing it through the Google Tag Manager UI. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a Google Analytics settings variable. So with the variables, there's a whole lot of built-in ones in Google Tag Manager already. So you can essentially use these within your tags and triggers as you want, and something like click URL will give you what the URL is of whatever element you just clicked. So in this case, we're actually setting up a new user-defined variable, which is the Google Analytics settings. The point of this is just that Google wanted to make it easier for you to reuse your configuration of Google Analytics, particularly with stuff like custom dimensions. You wouldn't want to have to implement them multiple times for all the different tags that you set up. So here we're just going to check in our tracking ID. With cookie domain auto, it just means that your tracking will work across subdomains, so just leave that as auto. And as I said before, there's a whole lot of other stuff that you can do in here, but we won't go into that today. We're just going to keep it really simple. So now that we've got our Google Analytics settings variable, we're going to go ahead and look at some triggers that we want to use for this tag. Fortunately, there's actually already a built-in page view trigger, because we're going to want to fire this tag on every single page view that happens on our website. So I don't actually need to set up any new triggers in here at this stage. And now we're going to set up our actual tag. So you can actually just call this whatever you want. I have a naming convention where I'll say an abbreviation of the tag type, the trigger, or the track type of that tag, I should say, and then where it fires. So all pages. And for this, we're going to choose Universal Analytics. And the track type is page view in this case. And then we're going to select our Google Analytics settings variable that we used before, which contains our tracking ID. And then we're going to add the all pages trigger, which is actually already in there. So now we've implemented our first tag, and we're going to want to test that out to see whether it's actually working and sending data to Google Analytics. So what I'm going to do is hit preview. And this gives you a nice little window for you to debug all your tags and see what's actually going on. So now that I've gone into preview mode, I'm going to go to my website, hit refresh, and down the bottom, we should see a little window that has all the various things that are going on that Google Tag Manager is essentially listening for. So in this case, we wanted to fire this tag on page view, and we can see that the tag that we just created is fired on this event. So hopefully if we go into real time in Google Analytics, we'll see a person on there. Cool, great. So that's done, easy as that. But that's not particularly useful for anyone. So we want to actually track interactions that happen on a website that that interactions that aren't just page views. So the first ones that we're going to be going through are email link clicks and tail link clicks. So if you've got a button that has an email address attached to it, or a phone number, you're going to want to track that. Then we're going to be talking about a custom listener for tracking when someone copies and pastes something, which I'll get into a bit later. And then we're going to talk about form submission tracking. So those are some pretty common website interactions that happen, particularly for lead gen type customers. So you can actually track a lot of other things as well, but just for this webinar, we're just going to be talking about the basics. So let's just get into the email link tracking. So what I'm actually going to do is set up my variables first. So in this case, let's just have a look at an email link. So at the bottom of this page, I've set up some buttons that we're going to track. So this email address isn't actually a mail to link. It's just text, but this particular one is. And if I inspect this, you'll be able to see. So you can see with this particular anchor tag that it's got a href mail to. So this means that when you click on it, it's going to open your default email client on your computer. And theoretically, people that want to email this person will just hit that button rather than copying and pasting the email. So we want to be able to see when that happens in Google Analytics and see where that person came from, what other things they did on the website, etc. So with our variables, we're actually going to use one of the built-in variables. And we're going to use click URL, but let's just take all of these so we can actually see what's going on. And now I'm going to build my trigger. So this one isn't a one that's already in there, so I'm going to have to build it from scratch. So I'm going to go for just links because I don't want this to fire on any sort of element. I just want this on links. And I only want this to happen on some link clicks. And we're going to do it on click URL contains mail to. So this isn't actually something that you need to memorize. We can use debug mode to actually see what's going on and the particular variable values for different interactions that happen. And I'll show you what that looks like. So let's just set up our tag. So in this case, we're actually doing event tracking, but it doesn't really matter. You could theoretically do this as a page view. It doesn't actually matter what you put in here as well. You could put banana, it's pretty arbitrary, but it probably makes sense for you to have some sort of reasoning behind your naming conventions. I'm just going to call this engagement email link click. And what I can do is put in that variable so it dynamically sends the URL that was clicked within the tag. And I might want to do that if I want to set up different goals for different email links that were clicked. Now we just need to add our trigger and save that. Oh, forgot to add my Google Analytics settings variable. Cool. So now that's done, let's test whether it works. So I'm going to refresh my preview and then refresh this page. So now hopefully when I click this, you can see it opened my default mail client, and we can see that the tag fired on this page, and let's just go through to check which particular thing this fired on. So page view, that was our page view tag that implemented before. Don't worry about these. Don't worry window loaded. Those are just different types of page view events. And here we have the link click. So it looks like our tag successfully fired, and we can see the criteria for which it was looking for. So click URL contains mail to, and we can see the variables that the values of these variables on this particular interaction. So we can see the click class, the click element, click URL. So theoretically, you could have used click text if the text was just mail to, but in this case, it wouldn't be. So yeah, it doesn't actually matter whether you've memorized what one of these variables to use. You can just click all of them and then go into here and look at what the variable values are for that particular interaction, and then work back from there and adjust your trigger accordingly. And now we're just going to set up a tell button click. No, I'm going to go back and set up my variables first. This tag actually uses the click URL variable again, so we don't need to set up that part again. This tag is very similar to what we just set up. Instead of doing contains mail to, we're going to do contains tell. Again, we're going to select event. Let's test that. So our tag didn't fire on this particular interaction. Let's see what the values of the variables are. Click URL. Oh, so here it's not actually got the tell button markup to it, so it's not going to work properly. But theoretically, you could use, if you know the phone number, you could use click text. But we'll go through a way to handle these particular scenarios in a second. But first, we're going to just check whether our events that we set up before for the email link click are actually coming through to Google Analytics. So let's have a look in real time. And we can see the events coming through here. So the email link click that we set up before. And if you want to actually set this up as a goal for your Google AdWords campaign, whatever, you can do this in here. You're just going to head to admin, then goals, and set up a new goal. So this is the part where it makes sense for you to have a good naming convention, because you're going to have to make sure that this matches up with what you've set up in Google Tag Manager. I'm going to leave the label as blank because that's going to dynamically pull through what email link was clicked. So now you have that set up as a goal. So as people start to do this on your website, you can go and see where particular people came from, like paid search, organic, referral, whatever. And then you can go ahead and import that into your Google AdWords account. And then you can use the automated bidding strategies in order to optimize more towards that goal. So let's move on to a custom listener. This one's going to be a little bit more complicated, and it's generally to deal with the scenarios where your email links and phone links aren't marked up correctly. So what we're actually going to do is track when someone copies something to the clipboard, and if that text that they copied matches the pattern of an email address or a phone number, then we're going to create a goal based off that. So we went through the example of one of the built-in tags in Google Tag Manager, but there's a whole lot of different tag vendors that don't have one of these templates in here, and you can build your own tags to do whatever you want with this particular custom HTML tag. So essentially this is you just writing your own code to track stuff. So I've got this, this came from a blog, I'll send you guys the link to it later. So what's happening here is it's just detecting when someone copies something to the clipboard, and it's keeping track of what they copied and how long that text was that they copied. And then we're going to push something to the data layer. So the data layer is actually what's running behind GTM, and all it is a container of stuff which GTM listens to, and these events is actually what's coming through down here. So this is a data layer event, this is a data layer event, and you can just build your own custom ones for whatever you need to do. So what I'm going to do is fire this on a different type of page view. This is essentially just the same as a page view, but it happens a little bit later. So let's refresh that and refresh our page. So hopefully if I copy this to the clipboard, we can see that data layer event happening down here on the left-hand side. And in order to actually access the other stuff that was pushed to the data layer in that event, we're going to have to set up some variables. So this is going to be a user-defined variable. And we're going to go data layer variable. So this just picks up anything that's in the data layer for that particular data layer event. Just trying to remember what we called it. Hold on. So these are the variables that we push to the data layer with that text copied event. So I want the clipboard text. Save that. So now again, we're going to have to refresh and refresh. Let's just look at what this value of this variable. So of course it's going to be undefined because we haven't actually copied anything to the clipboard yet. Now, aha, so we can see the text in there. And now what you can do is use that in tags and triggers. What I'm going to do is send this off to Google Analytics as an event, and then I'm going to set up my goal so that if the clipboard text matches the pattern of an email address, then make it trigger a goal. So this process is very similar to what we did before. UI event into clipboard. So that's going to dynamically send the clipboard text. And now we're going to have to set up a new trigger. If it's not one of the built-in trigger types and it's a data layer event, then you need to hit custom event. Let's refresh that. Refresh this. So I'm just copying that to the clipboard. You can see our data layer event on the left-hand side here. And we can see the clipboard text. So hopefully, if we go into Google Analytics now, we can see this event coming through. Cool. So let's verify that this has actually got the right clipboard text. Cool. So now that the event's in there, we can set up the corresponding goal for that event. So again, we're going to go admin goals, new goal. Ooh, that should really be text copy because it's going to send an event every time I. Doesn't matter. Email. Regular expressions for email addresses are never going to be perfect. but you can find some pretty good ones on here. Some of these are pretty long, so now this should theoretically fire a goal anytime the clipboard copy is of the pattern of an email address. So now we can actually capture the people who haven't got their default mail client set up, like me. As you saw before, all it did was open up the mail app, which I haven't set up. So if this was me and I wanted to email someone, then I would definitely be copying and pasting that email. So the last bit of tracking that we're going to set up is form submissions. Now, forms are actually really complicated and everyone implements them in different ways. So we're going to go through this particular scenario. I don't think the built-in form tracking from Google Tag Manager is going to work, but we'll give you a strategy to deal with the scenario where it doesn't actually work. So let's just set up our variables that we're going to use for our form. So we've already got some built-in form related variables. We're just going to use form classes and form IDs. And we're going to set up our trigger. So we're actually going to want to look and see what the ID or class or whatever identifying markup we have to track this form. So we're just looking for the top of the form element. Hopefully we can see it here. Cool. So I can see the form tag there. It's got the class of DM resp design row, and it's got the ID of this number. So if you want to track one particular form, you should use an ID if it has it, because that ID is not going to be repeated somewhere in that same page. But if you don't have that option, you can use class, or you can actually use any of these other different things that are in here to match that particular form. So I'm going to say fire this tag when this form ID equals the ID of our form. Wait for tags. I probably wouldn't use it. It can sometimes break your website. And check validation is if there's anything that's preventing the form from submitting. For example, they've got some required fields, whatever. This will stop that tag from firing if that submission has been blocked. So generally we're going to want to use check validation first, and then if it doesn't work properly, then we're going to want to take it off. And we're just going to use this on all pages. Cool. Let's refresh that. It's gone to responsive mode. And hopefully we'll see the event that happens on the left-hand side. But in this case, unfortunately, this form hasn't been built in a way in which Google Tag Manager can listen to the form submissions. But fortunately, most common website platforms actually have a way around this where you can use one of those custom HTML tags that we used before for the copy and paste listener. So what I'm going to do is do the JavaScript API. So this is generally something that you'll search for any website platform that you have. So for Squarespace, you go Squarespace JavaScript API form tracking, and generally you'll find something. Just going to search for form submission. Just doing the exact same thing I did before with a copy and paste listener, but doing it for the form submission listener. Let's refresh that. Refresh this. Cool. So now we can actually track when that form submission happens, create a custom event trigger to then fire tags exactly the same as we did before. Oh. Great. So now our event tag has fired. Sent that to Google Analytics. Let's verify that. Great. So now we can see it here, and we can set up a goal. Cool, so now that's all done. So that's it. That's all the stuff that we're going to be covering today. Just a little recap of what we talked about. So GTM, the point of GTM is that it used to be a real pain to get this sort of tracking done on a website. You'd have to go back and forth with the developer. Your tags would be strewn around the website. It'd be really hard to manage. So tag management systems were developed in order to deal with that problem. Google made a free one called Google Tag Manager, and we can set up a whole lot of different tracking in Google Tag Manager. For example, clicks on tail buttons, clicks on mail to buttons, when you copy text to the clipboard, form submissions, and there's a whole lot of other things that you could potentially be tracking, like scrolls, views of videos, etc. Does anyone have any questions in the chat, something they want me to talk about for the last 5 minutes or so? Just have a look. No? All right. So what I'll do is export this container for you and try and get out to you, probably via email, or I'll put it up on a landing page for you to download. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'll just chuck my email in the chat. And if there's any questions that I find that come through quite often, I'll try and put up a FAQ, something like that. And we'll probably be doing some more content around Google Tag Manager, probably something that's not aimed more for beginners, but more like a intermediate or advanced content, but we can still put up more beginner content on our blog, and maybe do another beginner session covering some other different tracking types, whatever. So again, thanks very much for joining us for our first webinar. I hope you found that useful, and again, you don't get good at juggling by watching clowns. So get out there, go practice, get really good, and show everyone how good you are. So thanks very much for joining us. Have a good day. See ya. Bye.